Chapter 16. What are the rules? Dis asked. Lyra sighed. It felt like the 100th time Dis had asked her to repeat them back. 1. Don't draw attention to yourself. 2. Keep to the sides of the crowds in case I need to make a quick escape. 3. If all else fails, start a fire. Very funny, Dis commented with mock amusement. 3. Smiling coyly, Lyra gave the correct response. 3. Always have my powers at hand in case I need them. Good girl, he patted Lyra condescendingly on the head. We won't be in Alexandria long. I just need to stir up a little surprise for our celestial friends. They were back in the real world. While she hadn't been aware of their shift into purgatory, after spending so much time there, she now noticed the small differences. First and foremost, here there was always some sort of noise. Small animals, insects, birds always clamoring off to the sides of the road. Second, but just as noticeable, colors were so much more vivid. She had never noticed the rich array of browns, oranges, pinks, greens, and so many others that made up a living forest. She had admired the crimson hues of her grove, but much like the variety of red she found there, she now saw how a normal forest was so much more than brown and green. Third, they saw people everywhere. Had she been a bit more well-traveled, she might have noticed this first in purgatory, but she had never left the village. Hardly 5 minutes would pass when someone wasn't either passing along on a horse or being passed by Dis and herself as they walked along. This, of course, brought its own special rule. She couldn't just wander around dressed as she was. She now had to don a travel cloak and hood Dis had procured for her, seemingly from nowhere. Not only this, but there was a special mask he had gotten for her. The mask was a plain white mask, but on the forehead there was a triangle with 2 wispy curls coming off to the sides. He had explained to her that this marked her as one of Maitreya's ascetics, a group of people sworn to poverty that traveled to help the sick. The mask, he said, would help keep others from bothering her. People are terribly afraid of getting sick, and since the ascetics helped the sick, they were stigmatized as plague carriers. Despite his insistence on drilling her like they were walking into a battle, Lyra still felt excited. This would be the first real place she had ever visited outside of Hedsum. What will it be like? You've told me the rules, but not what to expect. Much like any other city, just a bit bigger and dirty, or so I imagine, Dis responded offhandedly. Which would be what? Lyra responded, somewhat testily. Pretend you're talking to someone that has never left their village. I forget myself. Dis smiled at her. Well, to be honest, I can try and describe it to you, but words won't be enough. Just wait and see. It'll be more fun that way. I will warn you, though, that there will be thousands of people. Everywhere you turn, you will see someone. Street vendors, apothecaries, smiths, farriers, stables, people in abundance, both pedestrian and tourist. We've been seeing a lot of people on the road. Lyra was having a hard time imagining this. There were maybe 50 people in the entire village. She couldn't imagine many more than that in any one spot. Dis's lips curled up at the corners, the laugh in his throat barely suppressed. You're in for quite a surprise. Feeling the excitement start to swell up again, Lyra insisted. Let's walk faster then. Don't rush. We need to wait till nightfall before we go in. Dis caught the look of disappointment hit Lyra's face. No worries. A city like Alexandria really lives at night and sleeps by day. You'll get to see it in full splendor. Lyra smiled, dropping back to the casual gait they had been at all day. Alexandria glowed like a sun. The buildings, remnants from days long past, patched with mortar, towered above the surrounding landscape. The city was placed where the southern woods ended, the desert of the north ended, but the fertile plains to the east began. Thousands of lamps lit every surface, casting the city in a red-orange hue and creating a multitude of little shadows. People flowed like rivers down the streets and alleys, creating little dams and eddies around the various vendors and food stalls. Nothing like this had ever even entered Lyra's imagination. Lyra, eyes wide, kept looking around, trying to take it all in. I know you are amazed, Dis said softly, but please try to make it a little less obvious. Remember, ascetics don't get impressed by this sort of thing. Keeping his words in mind, Lyra started holding her face in one direction and did her best to swivel her eyes behind the mask to take it all in. Of course, a person walking down a crowded street with her head clearly turned to the side would draw more attention than a gawking tourist. Dis laughed. Look around, just look slowly. As it was, you looked like you were trying to imitate a hummingbird. Lyra flushed, but was happy she could look around again. Everywhere there was something to see. Off a little way to the right was a man selling some sort of meat stuck on a stick. She couldn't tell exactly what it was, maybe some sort of pork, but the scent wafting towards her made figuring out what animal it came from less important than trying it. Can we get something to eat? You can blend into shadows, Dis replied, scanning the area around them, looking for something. Simply glide over and grab one while the man isn't looking. That's Stilling, Lyra responded, almost automatically. And you are the daughter of the god of darkness, death, and chaos. I doubt Stilling some skewers are going to rank very highly against that, Dis said. Lyra had to concede he had a point. Stealing should be the least of her concerns, so she tapped into her powers and slipped in with the shadows. It didn't matter that there were lights everywhere. Due to the way fire cast its light, there was always shadows everywhere as well. She didn't even have to worry about jumping from shadow to shadow. She was able to simply walk right up to the stand. She felt a little nervous, but she could still see her father standing right where she had left him. Holding her breath, she watched the vendor. As soon as he directed his attention to a customer on the other side of the stand, she snatched 2 of the skewers. Heart racing, she practically ran back to Dis. I did it, she said, catching her breath. I actually did it. She felt elated, the sense that she had just done something she had always been taught was wrong, and got away with it, adding a somehow sweeter taste to her little victory. I brought you one. This pulled Dis from his search. Thank you. He seemed confused. She held the extra skewer out to him. He took it from her carefully, as if he were picking up a dangerous animal. Dis watched as Lyra used one hand to pull her mask forward, while holding the skewer with the other. He didn't know how to react. It had been a long time since anyone had done something for him out of kindness. She seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the meat, whatever it was. Dis, himself, hadn't needed to, nor had he, eat since the day he ascended. He couldn't just throw it away, though. He didn't want to risk hurting Lyra's feelings, so he decided to simply take a bite and see what happened. The meat smelled sweet, like it had been cured in honey. Juices ran over crackled skin, inviting and reminding him of a place he had long forgotten. As he drew it closer to his mouth, he wondered, would this moment, this place and time, be what it would have been if he hadn't been trapped? He took a bite. Immediately the meat turned to ash. He caught himself quickly before he spit it out. Instead, he swallowed and looked at his daughter. He smiled, saw her smile in return. The moment was lost to him, though, turned to ash with the meat. Let's walk a bit. He started to lead the way. He was pretty sure he had spotted the building he wanted. Small compared to the monoliths around it, but the 3-story building was obviously packed with people, and more were trying to press their way in each moment. He stepped up to what looked like a jewelry stall. Excuse me, but what is the building over there? He gestured at the 3-story house. That would be a house of sin, brother, the vendor responded. Not a place one of your order would like, nor be welcome to. That one, in particular, is the biggest gambling den in the entirety of Alexandria. Is that all? Simply gambling? Dis asked. No, but that is the biggest part of it. The vendor seemed to be confused by Dis's dismissive tone. There are prostitutes and drugs, but those are just extras. Good, Dis said. He realized a little belatedly, too casually. Quickly, he interjected. Prostitutes are easily overlooked in the world. I shall check in to see if any need tending to. The vendor didn't seem to buy his explanation, but offered no protest. Sure. Disappointment was thick in his response. Dis pulled Lyra to the side of the paths, a little away from prying ears. I need to go in there. I won't be gone long, maybe a half hour. You should wait out here for me. But Lyra started to protest. I have a challenge for you while you wait, Dis interrupted. I want you to steal something for me from someone's pocket, from the jeweler I was talking to, and from inside one of the apartments around us. It'll be good practice for you to sneak around in crowded places. How will you find me? Lyra said, quietly, nervously. You have some of my powers. As long as you are using them, I will be able to find you. He didn't mention that even if she weren't using them, he could still find her. You have a half hour. Hop to and have fun. Dis smiled at her one last time before he strolled off towards the building, a bounce in his step. Lyra didn't know what he had planned, nor did she really care. He would tell her when he decided she should know. In the meantime, she had work to do. Chapter 17. Screams, far off, faint, growing louder, but muffled like they were coming through water. Slowly his eyes opened. Briefly, he glimpsed a giant black figure a few feet away. He wondered where the screams were coming from. His eyes were closed. Slowly he opened them again. The screams are gone, but so is the figure. tried to move his head, and his vision blurred. Nausea gripped his stomach, and pain blossomed behind his eyes. He let his lids drop again. Roland felt his eyes had only been shut a few moments this time. The sense of pain never left him, so he assumed he didn't faint. He braced himself and opened his eyes once more. His vision was still a little fuzzy, but he could make out the picture around him. He could see Cyrus across the small clearing from him, bound to a pole by the same webbing that had been used to gag Sarah. A few feet to Cyrus's right, Severin was trussed up in the same manner. Turning his head further to the right, he could tell Sarah was beside him, done up just like the others. Slowly, the realization that he was bound this way himself dawned. Taking a deep breath, he straightened out as much as he could. Whatever the creature had used to knock him out had left him feeling like he had been kicked in the head by a horse and then dragged for a mile behind it. He tried stretching and found turning his head was about the most he could do. His fingers were free, but his arms were bound from his shoulders down to his wrists. His legs, if they were bound like the others, were covered from hip to ankle. Another side effect of his waking mind was the slow descent into terror. He couldn't see a way out of the situation. If he were lucky, he might be able to hit some of the creatures with a bolt of electricity. The last time he had actively tried to use it, he had almost killed all his friends. Severin had specifically asked him not to try and use it again until they reached Felvar's domain. He didn't trust his aim to suddenly improve just because of the danger. He heard the cracking of sticks to his left, so he turned his head just in time to see the giant thing that had captured him walk into the clearing. The thing truly was a nightmare. Its body was like a black widow, sleek and shiny, with 8 legs ending in razor-sharp points and bigger than a horse. From the front of its body, though, extended the torso of a woman, bare-chested with 6 breasts, but covered in the same sleek black carapace as the rest of it. Her arms seemed normal until you noticed the 3-fingered hands. The hands he remembered from the way they felt. Powerful, dipped in claws, but capable of a vice-like grip. Her head was the crowning achievement of this nightmare creature. It was shaped like a human if you ignored the jaw, which was made of mandibles shaped like feathered hand fans. She had a normal nose and 2 eyes, though the eyes were overly large. Atop her head was a crest of hair, thick and coarse like rope. He heard her making some sort of clicking noise, followed by deep guttural ululations. That's when he noticed the carpet of shadows at her feet. It vibrated. As she kept making different noises, parts of the carpet would dive off in different directions. When one of these waves flew past his feet, he saw it was a wave of spiders, each themselves the size of a melon. As she moved, the carpet moved with her. The crunching he had mistaken for branches was simply any of the strays that got caught under her feet. She looked in his direction, noticing he was awake. "It is awake," she spoke, clicks and hisses providing background to her voice. "Good. Now it can witness." The mandibles spread. She seemed to be attempting a smile. Cyrus started twitching. Roland could hear him trying to make noises from beneath his gag. "This one wishes to speak, yes?" She leaned in close to Cyrus. He stopped his movements but kept making sounds. "Well," she menacingly lowered her voice. "Do you?" Cyrus, keeping his eyes locked to hers, simply nodded his head. The beast used its clawed fingers to easily snatch the gag off Cyrus's face. "You may speak, but make too much noise and I'll remove your tongue." "First, I suppose, thank you for taking off that damn nasty-tasting gag," Cyrus replied. "You're welcome," the creature nodded, clearly not noticing Cyrus's tone. "Gratitude will go a long way towards making your death less painful." Cyrus swallowed, mulling his next words carefully. "Is death absolutely necessary?" "Queen Rainey, or my queen from this point forward." She spoke proudly. Even the capitals were clear in her pronunciation. "It would be wise to address me as such. To its question, I must feed my children." Her voice descending towards the last words, her arm gesturing towards the ground. Cyrus's eyes followed the gesture and took in the writhing mass of spiders congregating around the queen's feet. Roland was only half listening to the conversation. He was feeling dejected and defeated. It was over, and they hadn't even really begun their journey. He looked around slowly, from Cyrus, who was now silent, to Severin staring blankly straight ahead, then to Sarah. Sarah seemed different from the rest. She seemed to be desperately trying to look behind her. Roland was staring as intently at Sarah as she was at the space behind him, when he heard the hiss, His eyes widened, and he tried to turn his head further. Stop that. You'll draw that thing's attention. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Either way, it sounded human, which brought him a wave of relief and hope. It goes for you too, Sarah. Immediately, Sarah snapped her face forward. Roland realized in that instant he should do the same. If I can cut you loose, do you think you can do anything to help the others? The voice asked. Roland considered the question for a moment. He wasn't certain he could control his powers well, but if he could create enough of a distraction while the others were freed, that's all that really mattered. So he nodded his head. Good, the man replied. I would have hated to have snuck in here just to turn around and leave again. Roland could feel the binding acting as a gag being jerked up and down as it was sawed at. Don't start talking immediately, nor pull away. Wait until I've freed you completely. That way you won't be noticed while you're still basically bound. The voice instructed, and Roland agreed it was sound advice. Whatever blade the man was using must have been sharp. It felt like only a few moments passed before he could feel the bonds holding his arms in place being sawed upon. The thought that he was bound hadn't bothered him until now, but being so close to freedom, he started feeling a touch of claustrophobia. Suddenly he couldn't wait until he could move again. The act of forcing himself to stay still truly testing his willpower. Maybe these bonds were thicker, or maybe the anxiety simply messed with his perception, but it felt like it took significantly more time to free his arms. Now he just had to wait for his legs to be freed. The crunching sound started, and Roland realized that the queen was about to return. She sounded like she would be coming back near where she had left. Quickly an idea developed. Staring at Cyrus, Roland hoped he would look up. Almost as if Cyrus noticed Roland's gaze, he twitched his head up a little, then locked eyes with him across the small clearing. Risking discovery, Roland slid his arm free and waved to Cyrus. Now he had Cyrus's full attention. He pointed behind himself, then pointed to the direction the queen seemed to be returning from. Quickly he pointed from his mouth, then back toward Cyrus. He repeated the gesture once more, emphatically shaking his hand at Cyrus. When Cyrus's eyes widened, he guessed Cyrus had finally gotten the picture. Shit, Cyrus whispered to himself. The queen strode back into the clearing, carrying something large and wrapped in webbing. The giant sack was clearly too much for the small spiders to move, but she unceremoniously dropped it on the ground, crushing a few. Excuse me, my queen, Cyrus called, trying to grab her attention before she started to look around. It worked. It wishes to speak to me again? Her mandibles spread wide, apparently her imitation of a grin. Go on. I was just curious what you brought back with you, Cyrus replied weakly. Ah, this? She pierced the sack with a leg and brought it up to her hands. Just an appetizer. She tore open the sack and pulled out a horse leg. The hatchlings are still too small to eat properly, so I'm going to help them. That she lifted up the leg to head level, her mandibles opened wide, her jaw distending and breaking open her face as if it had split from her nose down to her throat. She bit the leg in half, then chewed for a moment, and then swallowed. She locked eyes with Cyrus, then vomited the leg back up over the spiderlings at her feet. She then dropped the remaining half in the middle of the vile fluid. Roland, watching also, realized what the screams were when he had first awoken now. He felt a twinge of pain cross his heart. He had been growing fond of his horse, trying to decide on a name for it. This simply added to his desire to see the queen brought low. He snapped back to reality from envisioning revenge when he noticed the smaller spiders swarming over the vile fluid. One moment the horse flesh was clearly visible, the next it was a seething, pulsing mass of shiny black. As the pulsing slowed, the spiders started to clear away. They left nothing but bone behind. She coughed in her raspy voice, wiping leftover vomit from her chin. They can be so ravenous, but they rarely have such big meals. She moved closer to Cyrus, running her clawed fingers through his hair. Don't worry, though. This one is mine. She leaned forward, her mandibles clicking rapidly, her jaw starting to split open again. Cyrus, sensing some sort of impending doom, quickly asked, How did you deem this one worthy of such an honor? Simple, she leaned back a bit. This one is brave, she said as she stroked Cyrus's hair. Fear is better to the little ones, but for me it is too bitter. And I have grown hungry. Her face snapped open again, and she leaned further back, preparing to snap at Cyrus. Wait, one more question, Cyrus screamed, making the queen hesitate. Roland finally felt his legs freed. Distract her. I'll free the rest, the voice behind him whispered. Roland glanced around quickly to see who this mysterious stranger was. Somehow he found Sean. How did you... Roland started. No time for questions. Get moving, Sean interrupted. Roland knew he was right. She had paused and withdrawn her mandibles again, but he knew Cyrus could only distract her for so long. He felt his side, realizing that the spiders hadn't taken his sword off of him. He decided that while they still had the element of surprise, he would try to help free Severin. This, though, meant getting to the other side of the camp unnoticed. Remembering how easily the web seemed to catch fire, he decided he had one trick he could try. He wasn't sure how well his lightning would start a fire, but he knew lightning could start fires. Aiming off in the direction the queen had come from, he gathered as much energy as he felt he could safely throw away, then let loose. Apparently, he had misjudged his own strength. A giant orb of white rushed from his palm and flew off into the woods faster than he could track it. No sooner had it left his hand than he saw a bright flash followed by a boom. The force was almost enough to stagger him. He held his feet, then watched. It didn't take long for him to spot the orange glow of fire. It also didn't take long for it to become clear that most of the forest was covered in web, and the fire was racing back towards him. As soon as the boom sounded, the queen rounded in the direction of the blast. She snarled. Finally decided to come down from his mountain, has he? She raised her arm, pointing off in the direction of the fire. Children, take care of the fire. Mommy must pack our lunches. She turned and noticed Roland standing, clearly free, while the small spider skittered off to the fire. How did this one get free? She asked herself, shifting on her feet to fully face Roland. Roland raised his hand, quickly letting a very small burst of energy fly towards her. She raised one of her plated arms before her and let it absorb the blow. The shiny carapace covering her forearm cracked, but it didn't shatter. The moment of elation he felt at realizing he could hurt her was quickly snuffed out when he saw the look of rage growing on her face. It wasn't the goat that did this. It was you. We were not informed you would be gifted. Faster than he thought possible, the queen started bounding across the clearing. Roland, just in time, threw himself to the right. He barely avoided the swipe of her claws aimed at his head. Roland rolled to his feet and started running across the clearing. He had to get Severin freed. Severin was the only one here that he knew would be able to help him fight her. Suddenly his feet felt as if they had been grabbed, stopping him immediately and causing him to plant his face firmly into the ground. Ignoring the pain, he rolled onto his back and looked to see what had happened. The queen stood a few yards away, holding one end of a line of web that was attached to Roland's feet. Knowing he didn't have time to cut himself free, he gathered some energy into his palms, then grabbed the web and let his power flow into it. The web lit up almost immediately, becoming brittle. He kicked his feet and put out the fire left on his shoes before standing back up. He had singed his hands, but he could deal with the discomfort. He started running again and reached Severin within a few strides. Catch me on fire, Severin commanded. Taking orders from Severin during training for the last few weeks had instilled in him an almost automatic submission to Severin's commands, and before he had time to think, he was repeating the trick he had done with his feet to the web wrapped around Severin's legs. It caught fire, spreading quickly up to the bonds around his arms. Severin burst free in a flash and was gone almost immediately. From behind the post Severin had been tied to, Sean and Sarah stepped into the clearing. Free Cyrus, I'm going to go help Severin, Roland ordered. Roland turned. It took him a moment to fully understand what he was seeing. Severin would be standing near the queen's legs, beating at them with Cyrus's staff. But the second she would try to swing at him or spike one of her legs through his chest, he seemed to flicker, then be on her opposite side. Roland unsheathed the sword, then ran to help the fight. He wasn't sure what he could contribute, but surely if he could keep her mind off Severin, then that was enough. When he was halfway there, the black carpet of spiders started to emerge from the forest again. Either they had finished fighting the fire he had started, or they had returned by some unheard summons. Either way, they were moving quickly toward the fight as well. Roland remembered the way they had devoured the horse. If any of them got caught by the swarm of spiders, they wouldn't make it back out again. All he had practiced doing was shooting the energy in a straight line or pushing it out of his hands. He wasn't sure how to make it arc down at the mass of eight-legged monstrosities. But he had an idea. Picked up his pace. He needed to be close to test out his idea. When he was within a few paces of the mass, he lifted his sword behind his head and threw it. He didn't care if it stuck upright in the ground or simply landed. He just wanted it as close to the middle of the group as he could get. Luck was with him, though, and it did land tip first, standing straight up and down, easy to spot amidst the swarm. He didn't waste any time. He didn't need to charge up a ball this time. Instead, he tapped into the energy he felt as he opened himself to his powers and simply let it flow through him while he concentrated on the sword. As if it were a mini lightning rod, the sword did as he had hoped and attracted the lightning. Barbs of the white light sparked off its handle, running through the mass of spiders, burning clean lines on the ground. As soon as he realized his plan was working, Roland started pulling on the energy instead of simply letting it flow through him. He pushed more and more of the power from the air around him and towards the sword. The more he pumped towards it, the bigger the burst became, the more the little spiders each pass killed. The carpet was slowly wearing thin. Holes started showing the scorched ground underneath. No! The scream ripped Roland's attention away from his work, causing the flow of electricity to stop. The queen was skittering towards him, slower than before. He noticed a few of her legs seemed to be bending improperly. Leave our brood alone, she swiped at Roland as she reached him. This time he didn't have a problem dodging out of the way. What's the problem? You were killing them yourself before, Roland taunted her. She hissed at him, leaning forward as she screamed, They are mine! What I call. Not you. You will have rid of them all. She lunged faster than he had expected. Before he could fully process what was happening, he was in her arms. She roared at him. Roland was blasted by a wave of warm, rancid breath as her jaws parted and her mandibles stretched out to the sides of her head. 2 long, dark daggers descended from the top of her mouth. Before he could even whimper, she buried them deep in his shoulder. It felt like fire started flowing freely into his chest. Suddenly she dropped him and smacked his falling body aside. She let out another roar of rage and started to turn to face the rest of the group. Severin reappeared and was again beating on her with the staff. Roland rolled on the ground, fighting to focus. The pain was overwhelming, more severe than anything he had ever felt before. Liquid lines of fire were moving out through his left arm, crawling down towards his legs, and creeping up his neck. He knew the pain was only getting started. He looked towards the queen, determined that he would keep helping. He was just in time to see Cyrus fall atop her from the trees above. He didn't come by himself, though. He brought with him a sizable portion of the canopy, and with it came a lot of webs. As soon as he hit the queen, Cyrus leapt off her and ran off to the side. Roland wasn't sure what Cyrus had been attempting, but he decided what he was going to do. He mustered up the last bit of focus he could, and let an arc of lightning loose at the queen. Just as he hoped, she burst into flames. Pain racked his body. His mind became absorbed in it. Immediately she started screaming and thrashing. If she were just covered in webs, it wouldn't take her long to shake the fire off. But the pieces of wood and foliage were catching fire and starting to stick to her as well. She was becoming a walking, screaming campfire. She thrashed from side to side, trying desperately to roll the fire off. Children, help me, she screamed as she slid into the woods, causing more webs to catch fire as she went. As soon as she was out of sight, Cyrus, Severin, Sean, and Sarah all converged on Roland. Stay still, Severin shouted at him. Unless you have some means of fighting a forest fire, we need to leave now before we get caught up in the flames, Sean said. Severin ignored him. Sarah, you need to heal Roland now. Barely just started practicing, she replied. Severin cut her off. Heal him now or he dies before we leave the woods. Leave him then, Sean said. Sarah shot him a glare. Having freed her or not, this wasn't a reply she could tolerate. She dropped to her knees beside Roland just as he let out a howl of pain. She pulled the neck of his shirt down to expose the wounds. They were already black with small veins pulsing out from them, and a vicious red fluid was leaking from the holes. She closed her eyes, let her mind sink with the world around her, then focused in on Roland. She wasn't sure what to do specifically. He looked even worse through her mind than he had with her eyes. He was a figure of light slowly becoming consumed by darkness. She did the only thing she could think of and started pushing her own energies through him. Roland gasped and started screaming harder. Sarah didn't relent. She started focusing her energy, pushing against the dark pool growing in Roland. The fire was starting to grow out of control, spreading through the canopy quickly. We need to get moving before we are encircled, Sean said. You might as well leave if you're that concerned, Cyrus spoke up. We won't leave one another behind, not without trying to help. Sean simply rolled his eyes and resumed watching the spreading fire. Roland was tossing and turning now. Sarah was having trouble keeping her hold on him. Help me. Hold him still. As soon as the words left her mouth, Severin and Cyrus both started helping restrain Roland. Cyrus holding down his legs and Severin gripping his forearms. Sarah pushed harder. She knew what she did was hurting Roland, but she had heard Sean. She knew they didn't have much time. She took a deep breath and pushed everything she could through Roland. Like a boil bursting, black fluid flew from the wounds at his shoulders. As the fluid left his shoulder, the shadow left the impression of his body in Sarah's mind. Roland, however, passed out. I think he'll be fine. She started to stand, but her legs gave out from under her. Cyrus caught her, and without asking, threw her over his shoulder. Would you prefer Sarah or Roland? He asked Severin. I can handle Roland, Severin answered. I can damn well walk on my own, Sarah shouted, smacking Cyrus on the back. You nearly fainted. We don't have time to argue, he responded, doing nothing more than tightening his grip. Let's go then, Sean said. He took off, Severin and Cyrus on his heels, the fire blazing through the canopy, chasing them from behind.